He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask where I would go, how I would finish school, or if I even had gas money to get there. My father, Russell Blake, just stood in the hallway with his arms crossed, watching the movers carry out my boxes like they were clearing a guest room after checkout. The last thing he said to me was, "You're an adult now, Savannah. You'll figure it out." Then he turned back toward the kitchen, where my half-brother Chase was bouncing his baby on his hip, smiling like a proud suburban dad. His wife Emma stood beside him, holding a cup of coffee and grinning like she hadn't just taken over a house that wasn't hers. The room that used to be mine, the one my mother painted soft gray before the cancer made her too weak to hold a brush, was now a nursery. My name was gone from the door. In its place hung a wooden sign that read, "Logan's Room." And when I drove away with my grandmother that morning, no one waved. No one even looked. Before my mother got sick, the house felt like it belonged to both of us. She let me paint tiny flowers along the baseboards in my room. She left notes in my lunch bag, even in high school, with little things like, "Don't let them dim your light, sweetheart." She always called me Savannah, never just kid or her. But even then, I knew my father saw me differently. Russell Blake wasn't a cruel man. He just had no space for softness, and softness was what I was born with. He never hit me. He never yelled unless I cried too long or laughed too loud. Then it became, "You're too much. Tone it down. Don't be so dramatic." He never said those things to Chase, his son from his first marriage. Chase only visited every other weekend at first, then more often once he got older. By middle school, it felt like he lived with us full time. He was everything I wasn't: tall, athletic, charming, naturally likable. He got his first car at 17. I got told to take the bus. My mom used to say, "He's just trying to earn his father's love, same as you." But I wasn't so sure. Chase didn't have to try. He already had it. When Mom was still alive, she shielded me from the worst of it. She knew when I came home crying from school without needing to ask. She would make tea, sit on the couch with me, and just stay there. She never forced the hurt to resolve. After her diagnosis, things got quieter. She lost weight fast, her voice got slower. But the last thing she did before the first round of chemo was write me a letter. She slipped it under my bedroom door. On the envelope it said, "Open when it gets too loud." I didn't open it for almost a year. Not until after the funeral. Not until I caught Russell packing her scarves into a garbage bag. In the letter, she wrote, "You are the quiet courage of this house. One day, your kindness will outlast their noise. Don't wait for them to see it. Just be it." I folded it back up and placed it behind her photo in the frame I still carry. Russell never brought up her name after that. He replaced her kitchen towels, her tea mugs, her blanket on the couch. One afternoon, I asked if we could keep the porch flowers she planted. He said, "They're annuals. They die. That's the point." That was how mourning looked in my house. Efficiency. Cut it out. Move on. Make space for what's next. It happened on a Thursday. I came home from school to find my bedroom door wide open. That wasn't normal. Russell never entered my space, not to check, not to clean, not even to knock. Inside, the closet was bare. My books were in boxes. The comforter my mom gave me had been folded, not gently, and laid across a chair in the hallway. My lamp was gone. So was the framed photo. I found it later, tucked into a box labeled MISC in someone else's handwriting. At the foot of my bed sat a plastic bin filled with baby items, soft toys, rolled onesies, a bottle warmer still in the box. I stood in the doorway like a guest who had arrived too early to a party that wasn't hers. Chase's voice came from down the hall, light and amused. "The nursery is coming together." I didn't respond. That night, Russell sat me down, not to ask, but to inform. He said that Chase and Emma were moving in next week. The guest room would be theirs. My room would be for the baby. I asked why the nursery couldn't be in the guest room. He looked up from his phone and said, "Because you're almost an adult, Savannah. You're going to college soon. It's time to make space for a family that needs it." I don't remember what I said back. Maybe nothing. Maybe silence was the only answer that still felt mine. 2 days later, my bed was dismantled. No one told me where to sleep. I stayed at a friend's house that weekend, then packed what I could into the trunk of my car. There was no fight, no screaming match, just subtraction, quiet and surgical. A few nights before I left, I passed Chase in the hallway. He was carrying a bag of diapers and didn't stop walking. He nodded at me, almost like a stranger might, and said, "Thanks for making room." Not sorry. Not, "I didn't know." Just thanks. It wasn't even my room anymore when I left. It just took me a while to realize I had already been moved out, one object at a time. The morning I left, Chase was assembling a crib in what used to be my room. Emma stood nearby, holding fabric swatches and sipping coffee from the mug that used to be my mother's. Russell was outside raking the front yard like he hadn't erased a person from his household the night before. No one stopped me. No one asked where I'd go. They had already made peace with the space I left behind. Leaving didn't feel like escape. It felt like dissolving. I didn't announce it. There were no slammed doors or raised voices, just an email to my principal requesting remote final exams, a call to my grandmother Lois, asking if her offer still stood. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I packed my clothes, my textbooks, and the photo of my mother. That was all. The rest belonged to the version of me who used to think home was permanent. I moved into Lois's upstairs guest room, a modest space with a view of the neighbor's cornfield and a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. She didn't ask for the whole story. She just made soup and set a folded towel at the end of the bed, like she knew I'd need both. There was no drama, no ceremony, just stillness. For the first time in years, I woke up without tension behind my eyes. I finished my finals online and sent in my acceptance to Winthrop College, a mid-sized school 3 hours south. They had offered me a STEM scholarship based on my early project portfolio. It felt strange having something of my own that no one could minimize or repurpose. I found a part-time job at a bakery in town. Early mornings, the smell of yeast and cinnamon, small talk with regulars who called me sweetheart without knowing anything about me. Most nights, I studied at the kitchen table with Lois humming in the next room and the television low in the background. The town was small, the kind of place where people still waved from their porches and asked how your day was without expecting a real answer. It reminded me of the life my mother grew up in before she met Russell, before things got complicated. On Sundays, Lois and I would sit on the porch with sweet tea and watch the sky turn gold over the fields. She never pressed me to talk about what happened. She just let me be. I kept the photo frame on the windowsill. It caught the morning light in a way I hadn't seen before, like she was still watching from a distance, quietly reminding me that gentleness wasn't weakness and that silence didn't mean defeat. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't need to. No one called. I didn't disappear to punish them. I disappeared because I finally knew how to live without being seen. It had been 9 months since I walked out of that house, long enough to grow new habits, new silences, long enough to stop checking my phone, even accidentally. So when the knock came on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, I didn't expect it to be them. I had just finished sweeping the porch when I saw the car. Russell's truck, still dented on the side door from the winter, he skidded off the driveway and blamed the road instead of the ice. Chase stepped out first, wearing a pressed shirt that didn't match the sweat on his forehead. Russell followed, slower, older than I remembered. Lois met them at the screen door before I did. She didn't raise her voice, just said, "She doesn't owe you a damn thing, but she's inside." I met them in the kitchen. They didn't sit. Russell looked around like he'd never seen laminate counters before. Chase stood near the window, his jaw tight, his hands shaking just enough to notice. Russell cleared his throat first. "We need your help," he said, as if he were asking me to pass a wrench, not rewrite a crime. He told me that Chase had been working at Granite, Axis Freight, the logistics company run by Darren Monroe, a longtime friend of my mother's, someone she trusted enough to recommend when Russell was between jobs years ago. At first, it was small things. Company cards used for personal expenses. A few numbers moved around in quarterly reports. Nothing dramatic. Until someone in accounting noticed missing funds, thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Chase was caught. And because Russell had vouched for him, signed off on certain documents, they were both implicated. Darren hadn't pressed charges yet. He said he was holding off out of respect for my mother. But the silence wouldn't last. A decision had to be made by the end of the quarter. That's when they told me their plan. They wanted me to say the money had been wired to my education fund, that Chase and Russell had taken the money, not for personal gain, but to help me attend Winthrop, cover tuition, books, housing. It was a story that could explain the transfers and buy them time. Russell said it could save their jobs, maybe keep the company from pursuing legal action. He said, "It's not lying if it's for family." I looked at Chase. He didn't meet my eyes. He only said, "You're the only one Darren would believe. He loved your mom." The room felt colder than it had 5 minutes earlier. I thought about my mother, her photo sitting in the next room, angled toward the light. I thought about the note she wrote me in the letter. Don't wait for them to see it. Just be it. Russell stepped forward. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've been hard, but this is different. We're talking jail time, Savannah. That was the first time he'd said my name in over a year. Lois came in and placed 2 glasses of water on the table. She didn't speak. She just put her hand on my shoulder and left again. I stood there, unsure of whether to scream or laugh or cry. But I did none of it. I just said, "You want me to lie to protect you?" Russell said, "We're not asking you to lie. We're asking you to help." I said nothing. Chase finally looked at me. His voice cracked. "If it were you in this position, I would have helped you." That's when I realized something. He actually believed that. They hadn't come to apologize. They had come to collect because I was useful now, because Darren liked me, because I reminded him of someone they once needed too. They didn't leave right away. Russell paced the edge of the room like he was circling something too fragile to touch. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His silence had always been the louder weapon. "I know I wasn't a great father," he said finally, "but I'm still your dad." I didn't answer, not because I was angry, but because the words meant less now than they ever had. "I would have helped you," Chase said again, this time more softly, as if volume could create sincerity. "Your family, Savannah. You always have been." That line sat between us like a broken chair. No one wanted to throw away. If I was always family, why did I have to leave with 2 boxes and no goodbye? Russell stepped closer. "I don't want to go to prison," he said. There was no apology in it, no ownership, just fear. Fear of consequences, not of conscience. They weren't there because they had finally seen me. They were there because someone else might, and that made me dangerous. For a moment, I wavered, not because I believed them, but because I could still hear my mother's voice telling me to be kind, even when it hurt. But hope without truth isn't love. It's just delay. I looked at them, 2 men who once erased me without blinking, and realized they weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking for permission to stay clean, to avoid shame, to rewrite the record before anyone else could see it. They wanted me back, not to welcome me, but to cover their tracks. That wasn't family. That was fear dressed in memory. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse them. The truth had already done that for me. Instead, I stood still, hands resting on the edge of the counter, eyes on the photo of my mother in the next room. Her smile was small in that picture, almost private, like she'd been saving it just for me. Russell spoke again, voice low. "You'd let us go to jail for a grudge." The words sat in the air like rot. I turned to face him. "This isn't about a grudge," I said. "This is about the truth, and I'm not erasing her to protect you." He didn't ask what I meant. He knew because we both remembered who had introduced him to Darren, who vouched for him when no one else would, who believed in him until the very end. My mother. And now they wanted to use her memory to clean up their mess. Chase opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head. "I won't lie," I said. "Not for you, not for anyone." He looked away. Russell didn't. His eyes were glassy but not soft, just tired. "I didn't think you'd say no," he murmured. That stung more than I expected, because he hadn't come believing in my kindness. He'd come counting on it. I walked them to the door. Russell paused on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets. "She would have helped," he said. I didn't answer, not because I disagreed, but because I finally understood. My mother would have helped them out of love, but they weren't asking with love, only need. The screen door clicked shut behind them. 3 weeks later, I moved into my dorm at Winthrop. Lois helped me carry my boxes, mostly books, a kettle, a soft blanket that had once belonged to my mother. We didn't say much. She knew how to leave space without filling it. The room was small but bright, with a desk by the window and white walls still blank with possibility. I unpacked slowly. Textbooks, notebooks, a ceramic mug I'd painted in 10th grade, chipped on one edge, and the frame. I placed it on the desk without thinking, like instinct. My mother, leaning into me, whined in her hair. The summer, she said, I finally looked taller than her. I adjusted it slightly so it caught the light. There was no ceremony, no closure, just a new space that didn't ask me to shrink. Russell didn't call again. Chase didn't text. I didn't check. One morning, I received an email from Darren Monroe. He said he'd accepted their resignations. No police, no charges, but no more chances either. He closed with, "Your mother would be proud of who you're becoming." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. The air through the window was soft. Not warm, not cold, just enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and let it touch my face. No applause, no apology, just stillness. The photo stayed there, quiet, full of light. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I signed my name on the dorm registry. Full name, no middle initial. No note, no explanation. If this story moved you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to BR Veteran Stories to hear more tales of courage, sacrifice, and the strength it takes to walk away from the people who never saw you in the first place.
The quarterly family investment meetings started when I was 23, right after Grandpa died and left his portfolio to be managed collectively by his children and grandchildren. The estate was worth approximately $87 million. A fortune built over 40 years of careful investing, real estate acquisitions, and business ventures. Grandpa's will had been specific. The portfolio would be managed by family consensus, with major decisions requiring approval from holders of at least 60% of the assets. He divided ownership among his 3 children, my father Richard, my uncle Thomas, and my aunt Caroline, giving them each 20%. The remaining 40% was split among the grandchildren. My brother Jason got 15%, my cousin Whitney got 15%, and I got 10%. At least that's what everyone thought the distribution was. I was the youngest grandchild at 23, fresh out of college with a degree in economics. My siblings and cousins all had more impressive credentials. Jason had his MBA from Wharton, Whitney was a successful marketing executive, my cousin Brandon was a corporate lawyer. I'd taken an entry-level position as an administrative assistant at a financial consulting firm, which my family saw as evidence that I wasn't cut out for more ambitious pursuits. "At least she's employed," Mom had said at the first investment meeting, her tone sympathetic. "Not everyone is meant for executive work." The meetings happened quarterly at my parents' house. Dad would review the portfolio performance, discuss potential investment opportunities, and propose strategic changes. Jason usually had strong opinions about tech stocks. Whitney advocated for real estate investments. Brandon analyzed the legal implications of various structures. I mostly sat quietly and took notes. What none of them knew was that I'd been systematically buying out family members' shares for the past 5 years. It had started during college when my grandmother was still alive. She'd owned 25% of Grandpa's portfolio as her spousal share. When she got sick during my sophomore year, I'd spent every weekend visiting her, helping with medications, reading to her, just being present while everyone else was too busy. 3 months before she died, Grandma called me to her bedside. "Claire," she said, holding my hand, "I want you to have my shares." I was shocked. "Grandma, that's worth millions. You should leave it to Dad or split it among everyone." "Your grandfather and I discussed this before he died," she interrupted. "He wanted to give you more in the original will, but the lawyers convinced him that equal distribution would cause less family drama. He was wrong and I'm correcting it now." "But why me?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who visits," she said simply. "Because you understand that wealth isn't just about money, it's about care, attention, and showing up. Everyone else sends cards and flowers. You show up. That matters more than an MBA. She transferred her 25% to me before she died, bringing my total ownership to 35%. But she made me promise not to tell anyone immediately. Let them show you who they are first, she advised. Then decide what to do with this gift. I kept the promise. Over the next 3 years, I quietly acquired more shares from other family members. My cousin Brandon needed capital for a business venture. He approached me privately, knowing I'd received grandma's inheritance. Would you be interested in buying my 10% share? I need liquidity quickly and I don't want to involve Dad in this. I bought his 10% for fair market value, bringing my total to 45%. Whitney got divorced 2 years later and needed cash for her settlement. She sold me her 15% share, grateful that I didn't ask invasive questions about her personal situation. My total reached 60%. Then 18 months ago, Aunt Caroline decided to retire early and wanted to simplify her financial obligations. She sold me her 20% share, saying she trusted my judgment more than the quarterly family arguing. My ownership stood at 80%. Finally, 6 months ago, Uncle Thomas had a health scare and decided to liquidate assets. He offered me his 20% at a discount because, "You've always been good to the family, Claire, and I'd rather it go to you than be fought over in probate." That brought my total ownership to 100%. I now own the entire $87 million portfolio, which had grown to $124 million under my quiet management. But I'd structured everything through a trust managed by my financial advisor, Richard Chin. On paper, the trust was the owner. My name appeared nowhere in the official documentation that the family investment meetings reviewed. I'd been paying dividends to family members as if they still owned their shares, maintaining the illusion while I decided what to do with this information. I was waiting for the right moment to reveal it. That moment came at the quarterly meeting 4 weeks ago. I arrived at my parents' house at 9:50 a.m., 10 minutes early as always. I was wearing what my mother called my office assistant outfit. A simple blouse and slacks, nothing expensive or flashy. Carried my laptop bag and a notebook. Jason was already there reviewing stock reports on his iPad. Whitney had arrived with her new boyfriend, a tech entrepreneur she'd been dating for 3 months. Dad was setting up his presentation in the dining room, which had been converted into a makeshift conference space. "Claire." Mom greeted me with a hug. "You look tired, honey. Are they working you too hard at that firm?" "I'm fine, Mom," I replied. "Just busy." "Well, you sit and relax," she said. "Let the boys handle the heavy financial discussions today. You just take your notes." I smiled and said nothing. The meeting started at 10 a.m. sharp. Dad pulled up his portfolio overview presentation, showing strong performance across most holdings. The total value had grown 11% over the past quarter, largely due to tech sector gains. "Excellent results," Jason commented. "I told you those semiconductor stocks would pay off." "The real estate holdings are also performing well," Whitney added. "Though I think we should consider diversifying into commercial properties in Austin. The market there is booming." Dad nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Brandon, any legal considerations with out-of-state commercial real estate?" Brandon, who was attending via video call, outlined tax implications and liability structures. I raised my hand tentatively. "Yes, Claire?" Dad asked, his tone indulgent. "I was wondering about the semiconductor allocation," I said. "We're currently at 18% exposure to that sector. Given the cyclical nature of chip manufacturing and the geopolitical tensions affecting supply chains, shouldn't we consider reducing that to around 12% and reallocating to more defensive positions?" Jason laughed. "Claire, tech stocks are performing incredibly right now. This is exactly the wrong time to reduce exposure." "I understand they're performing well currently," I replied calmly. "But the indicators suggest we're near a sector peak. Historical patterns show." "Investment meetings are for actual contributors," Dad interrupted, his smirk barely concealed. "Not office assistants who read articles on their lunch breaks. Leave the strategic decisions to people who understand market dynamics." Mom nodded in agreement. "Sweetheart, your concern is sweet, but the boys have been studying these markets for years. Jason has his MBA, your father has 40 years of experience. And I have an economics degree and 5 years of research," I pointed out quietly. "An undergraduate degree isn't the same as real-world expertise," Jason said dismissively. Maybe focus on taking good notes and let us handle the actual decisions. I sat back and resumed typing on my laptop. Let them continue, I thought. Just a little longer. The meeting proceeded with Dad proposing several major portfolio changes, increasing semiconductor exposure to 25%, liquidating defensive bond positions to free up capital, and making a $15 million investment in a private equity fund that Jason had recommended. This private equity opportunity is time-sensitive, Jason explained enthusiastically. They're closing the fund next month and they're only accepting qualified investors. We need to move quickly. What's the investment focus? I asked. Emerging tech companies, AI infrastructure, that sector, Jason replied vaguely. The fund has a strong track record. 23% average annual returns over the past 5 years. What's the fee structure? I pressed. Jason frowned. The usual. 2 and 20. That's extremely high, I noted. And a 5-year track record isn't long enough to evaluate consistency, especially in a bull market. What's their performance in downturns? Claire, Dad sighed, this is exactly what we're talking about. You're focusing on minor details while missing the big picture. This fund is exactly the kind of aggressive growth opportunity we should be pursuing. With $15 million of family money, I added. That's 12% of the total portfolio in a single illiquid investment with high fees and limited track record. You're being overly cautious, Whitney said. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to generate real returns. I agree with calculated risks, I replied. This just doesn't seem calculated enough. Vote time, Dad announced, clearly tired of my questions. All in favor of the private equity investment? Jason raised his hand immediately. Whitney followed. Dad raised his own hand. Brandon on the video screen raised his hand as well. All opposed? Dad asked perfunctorily. I raised my hand alone. Motion carries, Dad declared. We'll move forward with the private equity investment. Claire, can you note that for the official minutes? Actually, I said quietly, the motion doesn't carry. Dad blinked. Excuse me. The investment doesn't have approval from holders of at least 60% of assets, I explained. According to Grandpa's will, major investments over $10 million require that threshold. Jason laughed. Claire, we just voted. Dad, Uncle Thomas, Aunt Caroline, me, and Whitney represent way more than 60%. You're the only one who voted against it. That's not accurate, I replied calmly. Are you saying we didn't just vote? Whitney asked, confused. I'm saying the ownership structure isn't what you think it is, I said. Before anyone could respond, the doorbell rang. Mom went to answer it, returning moments later with Richard Chin, my financial advisor and the trust manager. Mr. Chin, Dad said, surprised. We weren't expecting you today. Miss Claire asked me to attend, Richard replied professionally. She thought my presence might be helpful for today's discussion. Richard set his briefcase on the table and pulled out a folder. I'm here to deliver the updated portfolio management report. As trustee of the Harrison Family Trust, I'm required to provide quarterly documentation to all stakeholders. He distributed copies around the table. I watched their faces as they opened the folders and began reading. The first page was a standard portfolio summary. The second page showed the ownership structure. The silence was immediate and absolute. What is this? Dad said slowly, staring at the document. That's the current ownership structure of the Harrison Family Trust, Richard explained. As you can see, all assets are held by the trust, with Ms. Claire Harrison as the sole beneficial owner and primary decision-maker. That's impossible, Jason said, his voice rising. We all own shares. Dad owns 20%, Uncle Thomas owns 20%. Those shares were sold over the past 5 years, Richard interrupted gently. Brandon sold his 10% 3 years ago. Whitney sold her 15% 2 years ago. Aunt Caroline sold her 20% 18 months ago. Uncle Thomas sold his 20% 6 months ago. All sales were voluntary and conducted at fair market value. They sold to Claire? Whitney gasped. But she's an office assistant. Where would she get that kind of money? Ms. Harrison inherited substantial assets from her grandmother, Richard explained. She also made several successful personal investments that generated significant returns. She used those funds to purchase family shares when members approached her seeking liquidity. Dad was still staring at the document, his face pale. What about my 20%? And my siblings' shares? Your sister Caroline and your brother Thomas sold their shares as noted, Richard confirmed. Your 20% remains yours, as does Jason's 15%. Wait, I apologize. He checked his notes. Actually, Jason's 15% was sold 8 months ago. I must have missed that in my initial summary. Jason's face went bright red. I didn't sell anything to Claire. You sold to Pacific Trust Holdings, Richard corrected. That entity is one of several investment vehicles Ms. Harrison uses for asset management. The sale was handled through your attorney. You received $11.2 million, which you used to purchase your Manhattan apartment. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing the attorney he'd worked with had indeed facilitated that sale. So the current ownership, Richard continued, consulting his documents, is Richard Harrison 20% with the remaining 80%. Wait, my apologies again. He frowned at his papers. Mr. Harrison, did you complete the sale we discussed last month? Dad looked confused. What sale? The liquidation of your 20% to establish the charitable foundation, Richard prompted. Your attorney sent the paperwork 3 weeks ago. I have the signed transfer documents here. He produced another document. Dad took it with shaking hands and reviewed it carefully. I remember signing this, Dad said slowly. But I thought this was just restructuring my estate planning. I didn't realize I was transferring ownership. The foundation required asset contribution, Richard explained. As discussed during your consultation, the 20% share was transferred to the foundation, with Ms. Harrison as the foundation director managing the assets. The silence at the table was deafening. So Claire owns. Whitney couldn't finish the sentence. Ms. Harrison controls 100% of the Harrison family trust assets, Richard confirmed. All investment decisions, all trades, all asset allocations require her approval. The trust documents specify that any transaction over $100,000 requires her written signature. He looked around the table. Which brings us to today's proposed private equity investment. That $15 million transaction cannot proceed without Ms. Harrison's approval. Does she approve? All eyes turned to me. No, I said simply. I don't approve. The explosion was immediate. This is insane. Jason shouted. You manipulated us into selling our shares. I didn't manipulate anyone, I replied calmly. Brandon approached me needing capital. Whitney approached me during her divorce. Aunt Caroline wanted to retire. Uncle Thomas wanted to simplify his estate. Every single sale was initiated by the seller, not by me. But you didn't tell us you were accumulating control. Whitney accused. Would it have mattered? I asked. If I'd announced I was buying shares, would any of you have sold to me? The silence answered the question. You would have refused to sell, I continued, or demanded inflated prices, or created family drama about power grabs. I avoided all of that by conducting private, fair market transactions with willing sellers. What about the foundation transfer? Dad demanded. You tricked me into giving up my shares. I didn't trick you, I replied evenly. You wanted to establish a charitable foundation for estate planning purposes. Your attorney structured it correctly. The foundation needed assets to function. You contributed your shares, which are now managed by the foundation for charitable purposes. I'm the director, yes, but I'm legally obligated to use those assets for philanthropic work. You achieved exactly what you wanted to achieve. But you have voting control. Dad protested. Yes, I acknowledged. Because someone needs to make day-to-day investment decisions for the foundation's assets. Would you prefer a stranger managing that $25 million? Dad had no response. Mom found her voice. Claire, honey, why would you do this? We're your family. I did it because I'm good at investment management, I replied. Better than any of you want to admit. Grandma saw it. That's why she left me her shares with instructions to watch how the family treated me before deciding what to do. Grandma left you 25%, Mom said weakly. Not 100%. Grandma gave me the foundation, I corrected. What I built on that foundation was my own work. While you all assumed I was just an office assistant taking notes, I was actually managing this portfolio, analyzing every position, identifying opportunities, and preventing the family from making expensive mistakes. Like the semiconductor overexposure? Richard interjected helpfully, checking his notes. Ms. Harrison recommended reducing that position 3 quarters ago. If that recommendation had been followed, the portfolio would have avoided the 7% sector correction last month. Instead, because the recommendation was ignored, we experienced a $4.2 million temporary loss that's still recovering. Jason's face went red. That was a temporary dip. Tech always recovers. Perhaps, Richard agreed. But risk management isn't about whether assets eventually recover. It's about minimizing volatility and protecting capital. The private equity fund you just voted for, I added, has a 40% failure rate on its underlying investments. The 23% average returns Jason mentioned are skewed by 2 extraordinarily successful exits that covered losses on 8 failed investments. The fund is essentially gambling on moonshots, which is fine for venture capital but inappropriate for family wealth preservation. How do you know that? Whitney asked. I read the full prospectus, I replied. All 247 pages. I also researched the fund managers' backgrounds, analyzed their previous funds, and reviewed academic literature on private equity performance. It took me about 20 hours. You all read the executive summary and trusted Jason's enthusiasm. The table was silent again. The portfolio is currently worth $124 million, I continued, up from $87 million when Grandpa died. That's 42% growth over 5 years, or about 7.3% annually after accounting for some lumpy distributions. The S&P 500 returned approximately 9.8% annually during that period. We underperformed the market while taking on excessive risk in volatile sectors. If you're so smart, Jason snapped, what would you do differently? I'd rebalance to 40% diversified equities, 30% bonds and fixed income, 20% real estate investment trusts, and 10% alternative investments with proven track records. I'd reduce fee drag by moving from active management to index funds for core positions. I'd eliminate single stock concentration risk. We currently have 8% of the portfolio in one pharmaceutical company, which is absurd. And I'd establish clear risk parameters with automatic rebalancing triggers. I pulled out my own folder and distributed copies. I've prepared a detailed investment policy statement outlining these principles. It's based on modern portfolio theory, adjusted for the family's specific risk tolerance and liquidity needs. Dad took the document but didn't open it. You've been planning this for years. I've been managing the portfolio for years, I corrected. The planning part was you all assuming I wasn't capable of it. The meeting dissolved into arguments. Jason accused me of betrayal. Whitney cried about trust and family bonds. Mom looked devastated. Dad sat frozen, still processing how he'd lost control of his father's legacy. Only Brandon on the video screen seemed relatively calm. Claire, he said, interrupting the chaos, can I ask a legal question? Of course, I replied. Is this structure permanent? Can family members petition to reverse the transactions? All transactions were voluntary, documented, and conducted at fair market value, I said. There's no legal basis for reversal. The trust structure is ironclad. Richard Chin worked with 3 different law firms to ensure that. Brandon nodded slowly. And the charitable foundation Dad's shares went to, what's its mission? Educational scholarships for first-generation college students, I replied. Specifically targeting students from working-class backgrounds pursuing economics and finance degrees. The foundation will distribute approximately $1.5 million annually in scholarships and grants. Brandon smiled slightly. That's actually really good, Claire. Dad, your estate planning attorney must be thrilled. You just secured a massive tax deduction while supporting a cause that honors Grandpa's belief in education. Dad blinked, realizing that Brandon was right. From a tax and legacy perspective, the foundation was actually brilliant. As for the rest of the family, Brandon continued, you sold shares voluntarily for fair market value. Claire didn't mislead anyone about the sales themselves. She just didn't announce she was accumulating control, which wasn't legally required. Honestly, this is pretty sophisticated. Little cousin grew up. Thank you, Brandon, I said. I appreciate the professional assessment. Jason was still furious. So that's it? Claire just takes over everything and we're supposed to accept it. You're receiving the same dividend distributions you've always received, I pointed out. Your income hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is who makes investment decisions. And frankly, the decisions I'm making are more conservative and better researched than what this family has been doing. But we have no say. Whitney protested. You have exactly as much say as your ownership percentage grants you, I replied. Which is currently 0. Just like I had 0 say for 5 years while I sat quietly and watched you all make decisions I knew were suboptimal. Now you understand how that felt. The harshness in my tone surprised even me, but I didn't regret it. The meeting ended badly. Jason stormed out, Whitney left crying, Mom retreated to her bedroom. Dad sat at the table long after everyone had left, just staring at the portfolio documents. I stayed to help Richard pack up his materials. That was brutal, Richard observed quietly. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. This needed to happen. You know they're going to fight this, he warned. Emotionally if not legally. Let them fight, I replied. The structure is solid, the decisions are sound, and the performance will speak for itself. Richard nodded. For what it's worth, you're doing excellent work. Your grandmother would be proud. The aftermath was painful but predictable. Jason didn't speak to me for 6 months. Whitney sent me a long email about betrayal and family values, which I didn't respond to. Mom called weekly, alternating between trying to understand what happened and asking if I could maybe give everyone back some ownership percentage to smooth things over. I didn't smooth anything over. Instead, I implemented my investment policy systematically. I rebalanced the portfolio, reduced concentration risk, lowered fees, and established clear guidelines for all future decisions. The first quarter under my explicit management, the portfolio returned 6.2% while the S&P 500 returned 4.8%. We outperformed with lower volatility. The second quarter, we returned 4.1% versus 3.2% for the broader market. By the end of the first year, the portfolio had grown from $124 million to $139 million, a 12.1% return in a year when the market returned 8.3%. The dividend distributions to family members increased by 15% because the portfolio was generating more income with less risk. Grudgingly, people started to acknowledge that maybe I knew what I was doing. The breakthrough came 18 months after the explosive meeting. Dad called and asked to meet for coffee. Just the two of us. We met at a quiet cafe near his office. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. I've been thinking about that meeting, Dad started. About everything that happened. I waited, saying nothing. I was angry for a long time, he continued. Felt betrayed, manipulated, embarrassed. But I've been watching the portfolio performance. Reading your quarterly reports. And I have to admit, you're doing exceptional work. Thank you, I said simply. Your grandfather would have been proud, Dad added. He always said the best investors were the ones who did the work that others were too lazy or arrogant to do. That's what you've been doing. The actual research, the careful analysis, the disciplined execution. I learned from his books, I said. Grandpa had an incredible library on investing, market history, portfolio theory. I spent 2 years reading through it during college. Everyone else inherited his money. I inherited his knowledge. Dad smiled sadly. We underestimated you. For years, we treated you like you weren't smart enough or experienced enough to contribute meaningfully. That was wrong. Yes, I agreed. It was. Can I ask you something? Dad said. Why didn't you just tell us? About Grandma's gift, about your knowledge, about your plans? Why the secrecy? I considered my answer carefully. Because you wouldn't have believed me. If I'd stood up at that first meeting and said, I own 35% now and I think we should change our investment strategy, what would you have done? Dad was quiet for a moment. I would have dismissed you. Assumed you didn't understand what you were talking about. Exactly, I said. You needed to see results, not hear promises. So I spent 5 years quietly managing the portfolio, learning every position, identifying opportunities, and waiting for the right moment to reveal what I'd built. Grandma told me to let the family show me who they were first. That's what I did. We didn't treat you well, Dad admitted. The comments about office assistants, the dismissive attitude, excluding you from real discussions. That was wrong and I'm sorry. I appreciate that, I said. The foundation, Dad continued, the scholarship program. I've been reading about the students we're supporting. It's beautiful work, Claire. Exactly what your grandfather would have wanted. That was the point, I replied. His wealth should do more than just generate returns for family members. It should create opportunities for people like him, people from working-class backgrounds who just need a chance to prove themselves. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're a better steward of his legacy than any of us would have been. I mean that. 3 years after taking explicit control of the portfolio, I was managing $168 million in assets with consistent outperformance and dramatically reduced risk. Jason eventually apologized and admitted that the private equity fund I'd blocked had indeed underperformed. 2 of its major holdings had gone bankrupt, and investors were looking at 30 to 40% losses. You were right, he said grudgingly. I was chasing returns without understanding risk. Whitney and I had lunch monthly now. She'd started asking me for investment advice for her own portfolio, and I was helping her build a more stable financial foundation. I wish I'd listened to you earlier, she admitted. I wasted so much money on actively managed funds with ridiculous fees. Brandon remained my favorite family member. He'd understood immediately what I'd done and why, and he'd supported me throughout the conflicts. You played the long game, he said admiringly. That takes discipline most people don't have. The quarterly meetings continued, but they looked different now. I led them, presenting strategy and performance. Dad attended and asked insightful questions. Jason contributed ideas which I evaluated on merit. Whitney focused on real estate opportunities she'd researched carefully. We'd become an actual investment team instead of a collection of egos fighting for control. 5 years after the revelation, I sat in my office at the financial consulting firm where I'd started as an administrative assistant. I wasn't an assistant anymore. I was now a partner, leading the family wealth management division. My success with the Harrison Family Trust had attracted other families looking for disciplined, research-driven investment management. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Sunday dinner at our place? Dad wants to discuss the portfolio's 5-year anniversary. He's very excited. I smiled and texted back, I'll be there. That Sunday, I arrived to find the dining room set up like one of our quarterly meetings, but with champagne and celebration decorations. 5 years of your leadership, Dad announced, raising his glass. The portfolio has grown from $124 million to $168 million under your management. That's 35% growth with lower volatility than the market average. You've distributed higher dividends to family members while simultaneously reducing risk. And you've funded scholarships for 43 students through the foundation. Everyone raised their glasses. To Claire, Dad continued, who proved that the best investors aren't the ones with the most impressive degrees or the loudest voices. They're the ones who do the work, make disciplined decisions and have the patience to let results speak for themselves. To Claire, everyone echoed. I stood up, my own glass raised. To Grandma, who saw potential that others missed. To Grandpa, whose legacy taught me that wealth is a responsibility, not just an asset. And to family, even when we disagree, fight and underestimate each other, we can still grow together. We drank, and in that moment I realized that the victory wasn't just about controlling the assets or proving my competence. The real victory was transforming a family that had excluded me into a family that respected me, not because of my title or my ownership percentage, but because I'd earned it through years of quiet competence, disciplined execution, and results that no one could deny. I'd started as the office assistant they dismissed. I'd become the investor they trusted. And I'd done it not by demanding recognition, but by doing work so excellent that recognition became inevitable.